These images typify what, to many of us, farming is all about. The genial yokel in his gaiters, plodding through an unspoiled farmyard, where an assortment of contented animals mingle amongst the bales of hay and pitchforks, well out of sight of the manure heap. The cackling poultry, the lowing cattle, it all creates an idyllic picture of natural peace and harmony. But let's not get too carried away by all this. Those are manufactured images. In the context of the food advertisements they support, they conjure up a picture of innocence and rustic wholesomeness. But that's entirely out of place in the high science, high-tech reality of Britain's farming today.
Because farming today is big business. The 250,000 farms, which occupy 46 million acres of land, constitute Britain's biggest single industry. And it's a highly capital-intensive industry, employing relatively few people. For instance, this tractor cost £18,000, and the combine harvester behind me cost £40,000. Some farming commentators have estimated that the cost to the public purse in special tax arrangements, subsidies and other farming privileges amounts to around £3 billion a year. Now that would be the equivalent of setting up 2 companies the size of ICI annually. Not surprising then that the objective of agriculture, which is the production of food, can sometimes appear rather lost. Over the last few months, there's been a vigorous debate both in the press and behind the scenes about the plight of British agriculture. There are growing doubts about the use of agricultural chemicals and their impact on our environment and our health. There are worries that the face of the British countryside is changing, and concerns about the wasteful overproduction of food. And today, taxpayers are asking, are the costs of Europe's farming policies too high?
In previous centuries, farming was a way of life for 8 out of 10 of the British population. It was an uncomplicated society, which faced the ravages of unpredictable weather and harvests that might fail, with hard work and a trusting faith in the Almighty. British agriculture operated mixed farming, growing a variety of livestock and arable crops depending on local geography and tradition. The north and west of the country supported livestock on the lush grass of the wet hillside pastures. In the south and east, gangs of farm workers grew cereal crops like wheat and barley.
But change was on its way, and during the early years of this century, while the livestock farmers flourished, arable farmers suffered losses and bankruptcies on a scale that drove many of them off the land forever. But in Europe, events were conspiring to awaken the nation's interest in the fortunes of its agriculture. A secure food supply was to matter as never before.
Britain began to grow more food. Here we can only touch on a few of the high spots. The ploughing of land that had never been ploughed up before, much of it with the help of machinery and fertilizers from America. The work of the Women's Land Army, the girls who have taken the places of men called to the forces. The digging for victory of the townsmen in their gardens and allotments. We have increased our arable acreage by 50%. We have reclaimed from bog and swamp the best part of 500,000 acres. We have dug out thousands of miles of farm ditches and laid thousands of miles of land drains. The result is that we in Britain are growing more food than we did in the last war, and probably more food than ever before in our island's history. This in the middle of the greatest war of all time.
By the end of the war, the policies of self-sufficiency in food, combined with new technology, were transforming the nature of farming. Geoffrey Wilkerson recalls the impact of these new trends on his own life as an arable farmer.
Combine harvesters made the most biggest change, I think. One time we needed a gang of about 20 men stacking the corn, and then a big gang all through the winter thrashing it. And there's 2 combines and 2 men driving them do it all now. My great-grandfather employed 46 men on 800 acres. And we have about 6 or 7 men on 1,000 acres.
Dramatic changes have also occurred in livestock farming. John Lubbock, a dairy farmer in northern Scotland, recalls what conditions were like when he started farming in the 30s.
I've been farming off and on for 50 years, and when we started farming, the conditions were pretty miserable for the farm worker. There was no water in the cottages, there was no electricity. There wasn't either in the farmhouse, as a matter of fact, but things have changed remarkably since then, and really agriculture, to me, over this period of time, has been a success story. We used to produce little more than 1/3 of what we ate in those days. Now we produce nearly 2/3 of what we eat, and that is really an immense change.
Well, it's changed enormously. We used to be in the forefront in livestock. We were predominantly livestock farmers, and now we are predominantly arable farmers. And this means bigger farms, many fewer farms, and very intensive farming. Years ago, so we must grow all our own food, more and more food, and the farmers of this country have responded. And not only the farmers, but all the scientists and technologists who support farming have enabled us to produce more and more food. But it's all at higher and higher cost. And while it's technically very clever, it's rather like Concord. Concord is technologically tremendous, but economically it is crazy. And we're doing something economically crazy in this country, trying to produce all our own food when we could buy it, nearly all of it, much more cheaply from other countries. I believe it's bad for the consumer because the consumer is paying a great deal more for food than the consumer need. It's bad for the taxpayer because the taxpayer is paying out billions of pounds for this. It's bad for farming because half our farmers have been driven out of business. It's bad for the countryside because our countryside is changing the looks, changing the beauty, changing in lots of ways, and I think changing for the worse in every respect.
About the only aspect of British farming that doesn't change, or at least not by very much, is the amount of land, about 46 million acres, available for agriculture. 50 years ago, that acreage was divided up amongst 400,000 separate farms, employing almost 1 million people. Today, many of the smaller farms have been amalgamated into larger units, and so there are now only half the number of farms, and only half the number of farm workers. Almost 50% of agricultural land now belongs to very large specialised units. Professor Colin Spedding describes how this specialisation has affected British farming.
The biggest changes have been in the types of livestock and crop plants kept. The most noticeable changes would be a decrease in the number of breeds we use in animal production, for example. So instead of having about 22 different breeds of cow from which we produce milk, 90% of it now comes from one breed, the black and white Friesian, and even that Friesian has changed from the Friesians that used to be. It's a much bigger animal and produces a lot more milk. The same has happened with other forms of livestock, and we produce vastly more pork, for example, about twice as much bacon, but from many fewer breeds of pigs. We only really use about 2 breeds of pigs now. In crop plants, the same is true, that the big acreages are in wheat and barley, and both of those crops now produce about twice as much per acre or per hectare than they did at that previous time. Same is very true of poultry, where we used to have a lot of quite attractive breeds of poultry, rejoicing in splendid names like Light Sussex and so on, and we now only have hybrids which have numbers. We don't even use pure breeds anymore. So the most spectacular changes have really been in the number of breeds used and our dependence upon relatively few. It's fair to say that the objective of British agriculture and agricultural research has been increases in the quantity produced, largely per unit of land and per man. And per unit of land, we've produced vastly more by the application of technology, but because it was economically encouraged, and higher production per man has largely been achieved by shedding men. So the problem is not overproduction. You have to expect that that will happen. And I may say that overproduction, of course, is a great deal better a problem to have than underproduction, which much of the world suffers from. The problem is one of the scale, the balance, and we overproduce to an extent which is not really tolerable anymore.
I think it would be difficult to overstate how serious a problem British farming has created during the last 20 or 30 years. Ever since the war, farmers have been asked to produce more and more food using more and more chemical fertilizers and sprays. They've succeeded dramatically. They've also climbed deeper and deeper into debt. They've lost contact with the most important reasons for producing the food, which is to promote human health.
There isn't the will to say now nutrition, the feeding, the nutritional health of the people is the objective of agriculture.
That isn't the case at the moment, you don't?
It's not the case. It's not the case, and you can't expect the farmer to look at it that way.
What sort of role do you think nutrition plays in agriculture now?
The farmer really looks at what prices is he going to get and how is he going to produce best to make himself money. He isn't really very much concerned with what goes on beyond that.
I think it's unfair to blame Britain's farmers. I think that governments have to decide on policies, and they structure the industry in such a way that it's profitable for farmers to do certain things. And over the last 10 years, I know that I have financed inflation by greater borrowing. And so the more we borrow, and the more we have to pay either in mortgage rates or rent for our land, we have to increase our profits, and we can only increase our profits by increasing production. And then we run into overproduction.
What's the answer to overproduction then?
It's a very difficult one, and it's very difficult to stop the upward spiral. When you're into a system of high costs, you've therefore got to have high outputs. To suddenly say you've got to lower your outputs is all very well if you can lower your costs. And you'll only lower your costs by paying your landlord less rent per acre, by sacking half your men who are probably old friends who you've lived and worked with all your life, and going back to an extensive system of farming.
It's not a good picture for farmers, really. To begin with, half our farmers have gone out of business. And I think we must emphasize that when the system began 30 years ago, we had 500,000 farmers. We've now got less than 250,000. So this system is not supporting farmers. A system that supports farmers keeps farmers in business. This system is driving farmers out, but it is driving the small farmer out. It's driving the tenant farmer out. It's driving the livestock farmer out. And those were the three kinds of farmers that were the most efficient in the sense that they didn't need taxpayers' money, that they could stand on their own feet. These were the backbone of British agriculture. They did a wonderful job, and these are the men who've been driven out of their farms, and their place has been taken by the large-scale arable farmer who employs very few people, perhaps only one or two men on a 1,000-acre farm. So farm workers have lost their jobs as well. At the moment, we have fewer and fewer farmers every year, but the cost of supporting them goes up and up every year. At the moment, the average farmer is costing us about £16,000 a year to support. Well, this is nonsense. It can't be allowed. The public can't afford to go on subsidising inefficient farming on this scale.
So how do you think then that Britain's farmers have responded to this demand to produce quantity above all else?
Well, he's responded very well. He's had to work the system. He's been goaded by the policy makers into producing more and more food every year, and he's done that. But he's only done it by putting in much more expensive inputs, more fertilizers, more pesticides, tying up every square inch of land. He's had to do all these things in order to keep pace with the demands of the politicians. They've talked about the balance of payments, they talked about strategic reasons, arguments which I think are phony, but they have persuaded themselves we ought to produce more and more food, regardless of the very high cost, economically and environmentally, of producing so much of our own food. I think our chemical industry have had a bonanza out of all this. They made hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds. That they were nothing in the 1950s when agriculture was run on a low-cost system. But now all of us in farming are in hot to the agricultural chemical companies.
Currently, those agrochemical companies are selling around £270 million worth of their products in Britain every year. And that means that our crops are being treated with 25,000 tonnes of active chemicals like these. Only 1% of the vegetables that we eat are grown on land which hasn't been treated. Maurice Frankel, chemicals consultant.
And in some cases, pesticide spraying is extremely intensive. Glasshouse crops and soft fruit are being sprayed 8 times a year, 8 times a season. Orchards are being sprayed 17 times a season. Hops are being sprayed 23 times a season. And one crop of lettuces was found in 1981 to have been sprayed 46 times with 4 different chemicals. One of the problems of using pesticides is invariably that pests gradually become resistant to the chemicals, and that a dose that previously killed them is no longer enough to stop them. And that means that some fungicides have to be sprayed every 2 weeks, whereas previously they were doing the job every 8 weeks. They may also have to be using much more stronger concentrations of pesticides, which increases the risk to the people applying the chemicals and also to the environment. It also means that not only the pests become resistant, but the pesticides tend to kill off the natural enemies of the pests. So the control is weakened on both parts. In agriculture, that means that the farmer, once he starts using pesticides, finds he has to go on using more and more and more alternatives in order to keep getting the effect that he originally got at a low dose and at a low price.
The problems we face from these sprays are made even worse by the modern tendency towards eating whole foods. Potatoes, for example, may be sprayed to stop them from sprouting too soon. Now, the Ministry of Agriculture figures show that by the time potatoes are eaten, the residues of those chemicals are well within safety limits. But they have studied peeled potatoes, and the trend towards whole food is encouraging us to eat more and more potatoes baked in their jackets. And it's in the jacket, of course, that the sprays reside. The same is true of wheat. If you extract flour from inside a wheat grain, then you lose the sprays on the outside. But once you make wholemeal wheat and bread of the most modern and tempting kind like this is, then of course the chemicals on the outside are incorporated in the loaf. But there may be some natural mechanisms that tend to protect us from the effects of those chemicals. I asked Maurice Frankel whether digestion tends to get rid of the residue.
We will get rid of some of it. Some of the pesticides will be stored in the body. Some of them are not excreted. Some of the pesticides that are being used are chemicals that are known to be possible cancer risks. Most people in the country probably have pesticide in their body tissue taken in through their food, and we know that it's in human milk and in newborn infants. Now, that's not to say that there's necessarily a hazard from that exposure, but there is a continued exposure for most of the population.
And it's not just crops. Animals also get similar scientific attention. It's estimated that around half of our beef animals are injected with hormones to promote body growth. And from the farmer's point of view, it's well worth it. He's liable to make an extra profit of about £50 for a single dose of drugs costing £2. But if we are then eating that meat, surely we're also taking in some of the hormones. Dr. Ray Heitzman.
We are definitely eating some of them. The question that really should be asked is, are the amounts that are entering the food chain, are they acceptable? Are they safe?
And are they?
Well, I can't answer for every drug that's on the market, and clearly we have a system in the UK through the Medicines Act which licenses drugs for use in farm animals, and those drugs have to prove not only that they're efficacious, that they work, but that they're safe. And safety, as far as the Medicines Act is concerned, is both for the animal that receives the drug and we, the consumer, who have to eat the product. However, when we examine the concentrations, they are minute, they're very tiny. I mean, we're talking about 1 to 100 parts in a million. It's like trying to find your golf ball somewhere in the United Kingdom. That's the size of the residue that you're going to find in meat from animals which have been treated according to the recommendations. So the 5 drugs that are allowed, I think it's fair to assume that any likely residues from proper use are going to be at concentrations below that which is likely to have an effect on the consumer. I think it's probably been true to say that in the past few years we've concentrated too much of our efforts on the production of food and improving our yields of crops or meat or whatever, and we've tended to stop at the farm gate. And nowadays, much more emphasis is being placed on the quality of the food that we're likely to receive.
But the high levels of use of hormones, pesticides and insecticides are an inevitable and necessary part of a system geared to achieving high volume output and maximum yields. Without them, it's argued, there'd be no guarantee that the costs of the livestock, land, labour and machinery that are needed to produce our food would be recouped from the fixed prices the farmer can charge for that produce.
In practice, what has happened in recent years is that the British and European agricultural policies have so enhanced the profitability of certain types of farming that today there is no longer a sensible balance between food supply and consumer demand. Nearly 20 years ago, the objectives of the CAP were to ensure the rational development of agricultural production. But not everyone believes that the way agriculture has developed has been at all rational.
Well, the CAP has some quite noble sentiments. It says farmers must have a reasonable return, consumers must have the food they ought to have, and the objectives set out in the Treaty of Rome are perfectly laudable. But behind it all has been an agricultural lobby that has sought to work the system as hard as it could, and it has goaded the Commission that runs the Common Agricultural Policy into pursuing this policy of self-sufficiency.
Well, under the Common Agricultural Policy, farmers, big ones and small ones, get guaranteed prices for whatever they produce.
And here at a grain store on an industrial estate in Swindon is one of the results of that guaranteed price policy: surplus grain. Over the last 10 years, UK cereal crop production has more than doubled in volume to reach a monumental 21 million tonnes a year. Annually, that's over 500,000 tonnes more than we need, and while ministry figures describe it as tonnage available for export, we know it better as the Grain Mountain.
And this is that Grain Mountain. Over 100,000 tonnes of British grain which has been lying here in a vast heap for over a year. It's in fact the biggest mountain of grain anywhere in Europe. And this grain in fact isn't suitable for making into the kind of bread we have in Britain. It'll end up being sold either for animal feed or it'll go to third world countries like Egypt, Cuba, perhaps India. The point about intervention originally was that it was going to be a levelling idea, a stabilising process. And the fundamental fault is that the big farmers get the same subsidy as the small people who need it. It means that somebody like a great barley baron in East Anglia is pulling in money for overproduction, which is meant to be subsidising small rural farmers in communities like the Greek islands, for example. That immediately unbalances the whole system, and it's a system which some people, even in this business, now describe as frankly amoral.
But it'll be a difficult system to change as long as excessive cereal production continues to be so richly rewarded.
Oh, I could gain quite a bit if I wanted to, but I prefer to have beef. This little small holding has always produced good beef, and I would want it to go on doing so. But producing beef is quite hard work. Much easier to grow wheat, and I could get rid of the cattle here, and we could go over to wheat. I could get grants to drain the land, because at the moment the land is too wet for wheat, but that's no problem technically nowadays. You drain the land with public money, get your hands on the taxpayers' money, drain it, and then you plant the wheat, and you can grow as much wheat as you like, and you're guaranteed a sale for it, because the Intervention Board will buy it, and they'll buy it at way above the world price, and then they'll have to dump it on the world market, costing the taxpayers another £60 for every tonne they have to sell on the world market. It is, of course, very bad for the consumer, it's bad for the taxpayer. At the end of the day, it's very bad indeed for British farming.
This remorseless industrialisation of agriculture has been particularly evident in dairy farming, where Britain's 3.2 million cows are encouraged to produce over 15 billion litres of milk every year. But the continued pursuit of maximum yield per cow and maximum output per farm has led to the extensive use of antibiotics and high-energy cattle feeds, and to the virtual disappearance of the small dairy farmer. Until recently, it was another of those systems which not only guaranteed profitability, but also guaranteed a surplus. Europe is awash with milk, and, unlike grain, it won't keep.
Currently, over 2,000 million litres of milk are being converted each year into butter and dried milk powder, so that it can be stored, or rather, as reports often say, be available for export. And this unlikely-looking cross between a steam locomotive and a missile launcher is in fact a modern-day butter-making plant, contributing, in its own small way, to the enlargement of Europe's butter mountain. The recently introduced milk quota system, which limits the profitability of excessive milk production, is at least a start down the road that may lead to the rational agriculture to which the CAP aspires. But for the moment, there is all that surplus saturated butterfat to be disposed of.
As a result of those agricultural policies, there's an enormous economic pressure on us to eat more butter. You may think it's already quite expensive, but the price should be even higher. The reason it isn't is because our taxes are used to subsidise the price, to make us keep eating more, simply to reduce the butter mountain. And another way they're trying to make us eat more butter is by getting us to eat less margarine, which is half the price. For years, they've been trying to force the price of margarine up by taxing the basic vegetable oils that go into it.
But agricultural policies do not always operate through the rather brutal economic devices of subsidy or taxation. Take potatoes, for example.
In most years, there's a surplus of potatoes produced, so you might think that the farmers would be encouraged to keep their production down. But what happens is that the surplus is controlled not on the farm, but on the market. The very, very small potatoes are rejected, and that keeps the price of the standard-sized ones high. And incidentally, part of the price often goes on adding dirt to the potatoes after they've been graded and washed, because it's assumed that you and I like to buy potatoes that look as though they've been brought straight from the farm to the supermarket.
And if cosmetic presentation matters to the humble potato, it has been particularly important in the government's grading policy towards Britain's apple harvest.
Look at this. Look how perfect it is. And these are all perfect, all the same standard size. The reason for it is that there's a grading system which rejects small or blemished apples. The grading system isn't so much about offering the consumer choice. After all, if you want small apples, for children for instance, they're often quite difficult to come by. It's more about controlling the overproduction of fruit on our farms by restricting the amount of fruit that gets to the market, thereby protecting farmers' incomes. And finally, there's meat. 30 years ago, Britain's farmers were asked to produce a small beef carcass which would provide an acceptably sized joint for the family table. But today, the demand is for larger, faster growing breeds of cattle, since increasingly we're buying our meat in supermarkets.
You can clearly see the effect of agricultural policies here at the meat counter. Mutton, for example, has almost disappeared because the government doesn't support its production. And look at this piece of beef. By any standards, there's a lot of fat in that. And that's bad for two reasons. Firstly, of course, because animal fats are bad for us in large amounts. And secondly, because, like humans, animals only put on excess fat when they've eaten too much food. And it doesn't seem to make economic sense to overfeed animals like that these days. The reason is that farmers receive a government subsidy, so long as the amount of fat in the meat they produce is above a certain level. Naturally, they all want to capitalize on that fact, and so they make sure that they produce fatty meat.
I think what British farmers are doing, quite naturally and quite rightly, is responding to the economic signals which they get. And the signals which they have obtained over the last few years have encouraged them to produce more of these very things by virtue of the price and by virtue of the fact that as much as they produced would be purchased. And in those circumstances, you really can't blame a businessman for responding to the signals that he gets. If you want to change him, then you have to alter those signals.
British farming has always been mixed traditionally, and I suppose now the lowlands is producing mostly grain, whereas I think that the role of the hills and the mountains is always going to be sheep production. And we could increase our sheep production. We could produce many, many more lambs if we were asked to do so, given the market, but it'll have to mean that we'll be exporting lamb. And of course the type of lamb we produce today is quite different. In the old days, they were producing a great big lamb. I mean, the most popular breed of sheep here in Gloucestershire on the Cotswolds was the Cotswold sheep, and they used to run these hills in their thousands to produce wool for the great wool industry, and also to produce a great big slab-sided mutton sheep that was eaten when it was over a year old, having taken a fleece off it, and it was eaten as quality mature mutton, which is something we don't eat anymore. We've forgotten how to cook it.
But while the trends in beef and sheep farming have essentially involved changes of emphasis, the trends in the heavily capital-intensive pig industry give much more cause for concern.
I'm not actually in commercial pig breeding, but friends of mine who are tell me that the industry is going rapidly down the drain. And the reasons for that, I suppose, are twofold. The market has demanded that they produce a very lean pig that is killed at a certain weight with no fat on it at all, and a sow that produces that pig that produces the maximum number of pigs per year. So they've bred for carcass quality and large litters. And this has produced a kind of pig that has to be managed very carefully in buildings, factory pig farming. It has to have a perfect ration provided for it. It has to farrow in crates so that it won't lie on its pigs. In other words, it's a really unnatural pig. I feel that we might have to return to an outdoor system of pig keeping, which requires less electricity, less capital in buildings, less very expensive concentrate feed because of the price of grain, and less labour. In other words, outdoor pig breeding. And today's pig can't survive out of doors because it hasn't been bred to do so. And we shall have to go back to breeds like the Tamworth, which is a coloured pig that can live out of doors and survive the weather, is a very good mother, doesn't lie on its pigs, turns round very carefully and pushes its pigs out of the way before it lies down, is an intelligent pig, but maybe doesn't produce the lean bacon that's wanted today, but produces it much more cheaply. I suppose that British agriculture is controlled very much by EEC policy from Brussels, rather than the demands of our own British housewife, which has led us off in directions where perhaps today's agriculture is running into trouble with overproduction of certain lines. I suppose that had we thought far enough in advance, we could have seen this happening, because our agriculture is very efficient and very flexible and can in fact go in whatever direction the market demands, which in other words makes it profitable for farmers to go.
Chris Robbins, what role do you think nutrition plays in current agricultural policy?
Well, up to now, certainly in the common market, whenever you see prices to farmers or level of surplus or composition of food discussed, you almost never hear nutrition mentioned. I think that given that we're now restructuring agriculture and trying to bring production in line with the market, there's a very good opportunity to start introducing more nutritional or health measures into the decisions which affect the type of food that are produced. And we can do that through the price of foods, we can do it through the foods on which quotas are put, and I think very importantly we can do it through compositional standards. For example, at present it doesn't pay farmers who are growing beef to produce a lean carcass. They could make it an incentive for farmers to produce a leaner carcass.
What evidence is there that either European ministers or British ministers are interested in pushing British agriculture in that direction?
It's happening very slowly, I think, because historically farmers have been given very strong incentives, very strong signals to produce very high yields of crops, and with very little attention at all to health. I think that politically there is now more input from the health side, from us consumers, from the Ministry of Health, from the health profession, to start including health aspects of production. It'll happen, and again it's happening slowly. I think what we need to see, and there's more discussion of it, is a food and health policy in this country which will link health to agricultural production policy.
Well, how do you think the farmers will react to all that sort of pressure? Because traditionally they're reluctant to make any drastic changes.
Yes, well, in the short term, of course, farmers are going to be upset because some of them have been making very large amounts of money out of this very wealthy industry and through these incentives. So some will lose in the short term. But I think that we're talking about long-term adjustments, and there will actually be, I think, a situation where the overall level of production will be brought more into line, and farmers will just simply alter the way they're producing and the type of food they're producing to match that. I think what's important to remember is that, first of all, it's over a long period of time, but also we're always going to be eating food, and farmers are going to have to produce it. So all we're really talking about is adjusting the composition of that food that the farmers produce.
Whatever the future shape of British agriculture, the fact is that 3/4 of what comes out of the farm gate is altered, is processed or treated in some way before it ends up in the domestic shopping trolley. It's a complex and fascinating story. In next week's programme, we're going to look at the way in which recent developments have served to distance us as consumers more and more from those who produce our food. It's a tale that is rich in high finance, in scientific genius, and also in intrigue.